You won't believe what happened when our HOA president, completely drunk on power, made the worst decision of her life, bulldozing my disabled sister's wheelchair ramp while she was away at work. But what this entitled neighbor didn't realize was that my sister wasn't just any homeowner. She was the governor of our state. And this reckless act wasn't just illegal. It was about to spiral into a nationally televised scandal that Karen would never recover from. But how did one wheelchair ramp cause an entire neighborhood to explode into chaos? The bright yellow notice plastered onto our front door made my blood boil. Another violation letter, the fifth one this month. And every single one was about the same thing, my sister Sarah's wheelchair ramp. My jaw tightened as I crumpled the paper, tossing it onto my ever-growing pile of Karen Thompson's ridiculous warnings. Behind me, the familiar hum of Sarah's electric wheelchair filled the air. She rolled up beside me, exhaustion visible in the dark circles under her eyes. "Another love letter from our wonderful neighbor?" she asked with a tired smile. She never complained, not about her demanding job, not about the accident that put her in a wheelchair 6 months ago, and definitely not about Karen's constant harassment. You'd think running an HOA would keep Karen busy enough, but apparently she had nothing better to do than stalk our house day and night. Through the kitchen window, I spotted Karen standing in her driveway, snapping photos of our ramp like it was some sort of crime scene. Her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer workout outfit couldn't mask the pure spite on her face. The day before everything spiraled out of control, I sat in the kitchen, gripping the latest HOA violation notice while Sarah parked her wheelchair near the table, her fingers rubbing her temples from exhaustion. Karen's obsession with our ramp had reached a new level, but Sarah refused to let it get to her. She had bigger things to handle, running an entire state while dealing with her recovery. Yet Karen never missed a chance to make life harder. As the sun began to set, I saw movement outside through the blinds. Karen stood in her driveway, talking to two men in suits, their gazes locked onto our ramp as one of them jotted down notes and the other snapped pictures. A sick feeling churned in my gut. Something was wrong. Karen had always been relentless, but this felt different. Sarah noticed my tense expression and asked what was happening, but I tried to downplay it, not wanting to stress her out before her early morning meeting. My gut told me otherwise. I pulled out my phone and hit record, zooming in as Karen handed thick manila envelopes to the men, her smug smile making my skin crawl. Then came the words that froze my breath. "Yes, we need the bulldozer here first thing in the morning. The board has already approved the removal." My grip on the phone tightened. They wouldn't actually demolish a wheelchair ramp, would they? I rushed to grab our permits and check our security cameras, but the moment I opened our records, I realized something was very, very wrong. Something Karen clearly hadn't accounted for. And by the time she figured it out, it would be far too late to stop what was coming. I was halfway through breakfast when the deep, grinding sound of heavy machinery rumbled from outside. My spoon clattered against the bowl as I jumped up and rushed to the window, my heart pounding. There, standing in our front yard with her signature red blazer and perfectly styled blonde hair, was Karen, gesturing toward our wheelchair ramp while a construction foreman nodded along. My stomach twisted as I spotted the massive yellow bulldozer parked in our driveway, its steel blade gleaming in the morning sun. Two workers in bright orange vests stood nearby, stretching out tape measures and scribbling notes, while Karen clutched a thick stack of papers like they were her personal declaration of war. I grabbed my phone and started recording as I bolted outside, my pulse hammering. The neighborhood was still quiet, most houses dark, their owners still asleep, unaware of the insanity unfolding in front of my home. "What do you think you're doing?" My voice was steady, but my hands trembled as Karen turned, flashing her signature fake smile, the one she always wore at HOA meetings when pretending to be reasonable. "Oh, good. You're home," she chirped, her designer heels sinking slightly into the damp grass as she strutted toward me, holding up a document. "This is an emergency order from the HOA board. Your ramp is in direct violation of Section 4.23 of the Community Guidelines." She waved the paper in my face before yanking it back, just as I reached for it. I took a breath, forcing myself to stay calm the way Sarah always did in press conferences. Karen, we submitted all the necessary paperwork, got city approval, followed every rule, but Karen just smiled wider. The city isn't the HOA, dear. And as the board president, it's my responsibility to uphold our neighborhood standards. This ramp is an eyesore, and it's tanking property values. Just look at how it ruins the aesthetic. The bulldozer's engine roared to life, sending a sharp spike of adrenaline through my veins. I yanked out my phone and pulled up Sarah's carefully saved property maps, legal documents, every permit we had. This is illegal, Karen. You can't just demolish someone's property without a court order. But Karen only laughed, that high-pitched, nails-on-a-chalkboard sound that made my skin crawl. Notice was given weeks ago by certified mail. We have a signed receipt. She whipped out another paper, pointing to a signature I had never seen before. Panic surged in my chest as I frantically called Sarah's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Of course, she was in a closed-door budget meeting today. I tried her assistant, security team, anyone, but no one answered. The workers began setting up orange cones, one of them hesitating as he double-checked his paperwork, whispering something to his colleague. If you do this, I warned, my voice gaining strength, you'll be hearing from our lawyers. This is a direct violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I tilted my phone, making sure my live stream captured everything. Karen's smile faltered for the first time. No HOA is exempt from federal law. I continued, loud enough that porch lights began flickering on up and down the street. Neighbors started peering through their curtains, some stepping outside. Mr. Rodriguez, our elderly neighbor, peeked out from his doorway before disappearing back inside. But Karen had already turned toward the bulldozer operator and nodded. The machine rumbled forward, its treads grinding against our driveway, its blade lowering toward the ramp we had fought so hard to build. Last chance, Karen, I said, phone steady in my grip. You're making a huge mistake. She turned back, her eyes cold despite the unwavering smile. The only mistake was allowing this thing to be built in the first place. Rules exist for a reason. The bulldozer blade scraped against the edge of the ramp, a sickening screech of metal against concrete. What she didn't notice was Mr. Rodriguez standing on his porch, his phone lifted, recording everything. And just as the first chunks of concrete crumbled under the blade, my phone buzzed with a message that made my breath hitch. Stay calm. Keep recording. Help is 3 minutes away. For the first time that morning, a slow smile crept across my face as I watched Karen revel in what she thought was her greatest victory. She stood in the middle of our yard, chin lifted in triumph, directing the demolition of our wheelchair ramp like she was orchestrating a grand symphony. The workers followed her every gesture, the bulldozer roaring as it tore through the structure, chunks of concrete and metal scattering like debris after a storm. She was so caught up in her moment of power, basking in the destruction, that she failed to notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The rumble of approaching engines grew louder, their deep, steady hum cutting through the crisp morning air. Karen remained oblivious, still high-fiving her loyal board members, completely unaware that everything she had built, her reputation, her control, her untouchable authority, was about to come crashing down. A sleek black SUV rounded the corner, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. Then another, and another. Red and blue lights flickered against the pavement as 3 police cruisers followed, their presence sucking the air from the street. A hushed silence swept over the growing crowd of neighbors, their murmurs fading into anticipation as the vehicles came to a stop in front of our house. Karen's triumphant smirk wavered, confusion flickering across her face as the doors of the lead SUV opened in perfect sync. The first man to step out wore an earpiece and a sharp black suit, his gaze scanning the scene with cool efficiency before giving a small nod to the officer beside him. Then, with the precision of a well-rehearsed maneuver, the back door of the central vehicle swung open, and out rolled Sarah, dressed in her official governor's blazer, posture unwavering. She exuded the kind of authority that needed no introduction. The moment her wheels touched the pavement, the entire street fell deathly still. Karen's lips parted, a half-formed protest dying in her throat as Sarah moved forward, her security detail flanking her in seamless formation. Actually, Mrs. Thompson, Sarah's voice rang out, crisp and commanding. This became a state matter the moment you violated federal disability laws. Karen took an instinctive step back, clutching her violation notices like a shield. The color drained from her face as she scanned the growing crowd, searching for support she wouldn't find. Not to mention, Sarah continued, her phone in hand, that you just authorized the destruction of state property without legal clearance. Her gaze locked onto Karen's with a level of authority no amount of HOA power could ever match. Would you like to see the deed? Or shall we start with a breakdown of the Americans with Disabilities Act? Karen visibly flinched, her hands tightening around the stack of papers. But the real blow had yet to land. The gathered crowd, once hesitant to speak against their self-appointed dictator, was now fully engaged. Phones were raised, cameras rolling, and just across the street, Mrs. Jenkins was already live-streaming on social media. But the best part? Sarah wasn't done. Not even close. She motioned to her assistant, who stepped forward holding a thick binder. My legal team has been reviewing your HOA's policies all morning. Would you like to know what we found? I watched as Karen's once loyal HOA board members subtly edged away from her, the realization sinking in that they were standing on a sinking ship. Smart move. The air was thick with tension as Sarah's assistant handed over the thick binder, the weight of it making Karen's hands tremble as she reluctantly took it. Multiple violations of state housing laws, discriminatory enforcement of policies, and Sarah let the moment stretch, letting the anticipation tighten around Karen like a noose. Irregular financial records dating back 3 years. The crowd collectively sucked in a breath. Karen's face went pale, her fingers clenching around the binder as if sheer willpower could erase its contents. I didn't, she stammered, scrambling for an explanation. But Sarah wasn't interested in hearing excuses. She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, precise, and utterly devastating. You didn't know that bulldozing a disabled person's wheelchair ramp without proper authorization is a federal offense, or that you were breaking multiple state laws. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, just as Karen opened her mouth to spit out another desperate defense, 2 state investigators stepped forward, notebooks in hand. Behind them, at the far end of the street, the unmistakable sight of news vans pulling up sent an excited ripple through the gathered neighbors. Mrs. Thompson, one of the investigators said, his tone neutral but firm, we'll need you to come with us to answer a few questions regarding today's events and the discrepancies in your HOA's financial records. Karen looked around wildly, as if expecting anyone, to come to her rescue. But her board members had taken another step back. The neighbor she had bullied for years now stood silent, their faces unreadable. Even the construction crew, the ones she had ordered to destroy the ramp, had frozen in place, unsure whether to continue working or flee the scene. The inevitable had finally caught up to her. As the investigators led Karen toward one of the waiting vehicles, she clutched her stack of violation notices like a lifeline, still muttering about property values and HOA regulations as if they could save her now. Meanwhile, Sarah turned toward the crowd. Her presence alone commanded attention, but it was her words that truly shifted the energy of the entire street. My fellow neighbors, today is about more than just a wheelchair ramp. It's about what kind of community we want to live in. She gestured toward the rubble, her expression unreadable. This isn't just about me or my right to access my own home. This is about ensuring that no one in this neighborhood is mistreated, bullied, or denied basic rights just because someone with a little power decides they don't belong. A murmur spread through the crowd, faces that once held fear now showing something else: understanding, recognition, anger at what they had allowed Karen to get away with for so long. But as Karen was guided into the police vehicle, her rule finally crumbling around her, I couldn't help but wonder what would become of this neighborhood once the dust settled. And more importantly, how many other HOAs were pulling the same stunts Karen had been getting away with for years. The morning after the bulldozing incident, I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop. Missed calls, notifications, and message after message flooded my screen. By the time I pulled myself out of bed and checked the front window, the reality of the situation hit me. Our street was packed with news vans, reporters already setting up their cameras, waiting for any sign of movement. But that wasn't even the most shocking part. A call from an old high school friend, now a civil rights lawyer, came with an unexpected revelation. Karen had a history, a long, well-documented one. She had been sued multiple times for similar HOA power plays, each time settling quietly before moving on to another neighborhood where she could start fresh. The problem was this time, she had picked the wrong house. And unlike her previous victims, Sarah wasn't going to let this slide. The governor's office wasted no time. Sarah held an emergency press conference right on our front lawn, the destroyed ramp serving as a backdrop for what would become a national conversation. Reporters fired off questions while she pulled out document after document, detailing every legal violation Karen had committed, not just federal disability law infractions, but a staggering 17 separate state housing regulation breaches. But the real moment of reckoning came when the neighbors finally started speaking up. One by one, stories emerged. Mrs. Chun, the elderly woman from across the street, described how Karen had forced her to remove her medical garden, citing community aesthetic guidelines. Mr. Rodriguez shared paperwork proving he had been fined repeatedly for installing a wheelchair lift for his father, a disabled veteran. The Baker family stepped forward next, revealing how Karen had threatened them with fines simply for putting up sensory-friendly playground equipment for their autistic son. The atmosphere shifted. This wasn't just about us anymore. This was about a pattern, one that had gone unchecked for far too long. Karen, still in damage control mode, tried to call an emergency HOA meeting to dispute what she called baseless accusations. But this time, instead of the usual half-empty room filled with her few remaining loyalists, something different happened. The community center was packed, and for the first time, people weren't there to listen to her. They were there to hold her accountable. Just when we thought things couldn't escalate any further, the real bombshell dropped. Karen's HOA financial records had been leaked, and what they revealed was worse than anyone had expected. It turned out that the fines she had been issuing to residents over the years weren't just excessive. They were illegal. She had been funneling HOA funds into her personal home renovations, disguising them as community improvement projects in the budget reports. The lawyer Sarah had consulted wasted no time in handing the evidence over to the State Housing Commission, which immediately launched an investigation into the entire HOA. But the best part? The local news got hold of the story, and within hours, it had spread like wildfire. HOA abuse wasn't a new issue, but having a sitting governor personally involved made this case headline-worthy. Reporters camped outside our neighborhood, eager to catch every development, while social media exploded with outrage. Meanwhile, Sarah wasn't finished. She invited disability rights advocates to our home, turning what started as a personal battle into a full-fledged movement. Half the neighborhood showed up, not just to support Sarah, but to learn about accessible housing rights, a topic Karen had ignored for years. But the real turning point came when residents who had been too afraid to speak out finally started coming forward. One after another, they shared their experiences. A young mother revealed that Karen had fined her for installing a small safety fence around her child's play area, citing aesthetic concerns. A retired veteran stepped forward with documentation, showing how he had been targeted for leaving his medical transport vehicle parked in his own driveway. Even the quiet couple on the corner, who had never once attended an HOA meeting, admitted that Karen had been harassing them over the color of their front door, demanding they repaint it, only to later approve the exact same shade for one of her personal friends. The community that had once been fractured by fear was finally uniting against the very person who had controlled them for so long. And as the pressure mounted, Karen made one last desperate move. She arrived at our doorstep the next morning, clutching a cease and desist letter claiming that we were spreading false information and demanding that we stop talking about her. But what she didn't realize was that she had just walked into a meeting with Sarah and the state housing commissioner, who was now personally overseeing the case against her. The moment Karen realized what was happening, her entire demeanor shifted. Gone was the smug, self-assured woman who had torn down a wheelchair ramp without a second thought. In her place stood someone who was finally starting to grasp just how deep the hole she had dug for herself truly was. The look on Karen's face when she realized her iron grip on the HOA was slipping was almost satisfying enough to make up for the months of stress and harassment. Almost. The reality was, this wasn't just about one corrupt HOA president. It was about changing the system that had allowed people like Karen to abuse their power for so long. Sarah knew that, which is why she wasn't just focused on holding Karen accountable. She was preparing for something much bigger. While Karen scrambled to find a way out, desperately trying to shift the blame onto her board members, Sarah had already put the final nail in the coffin. Security footage. One of our neighbors, Mr. Rodriguez, had been quietly documenting Karen's rule-breaking for years. Footage of her harassing elderly homeowners, sending out false violation notices, even discussing unauthorized fines with her board members. It was all captured, time-stamped, and now in the hands of the State Housing Commission. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse for her, the final piece of evidence surfaced. Karen had never even legally filed the correct documents to become HOA president. She had simply taken over when the last president moved away, manipulating the board into letting her assume full control without any official election. When Sarah's legal team uncovered this, it was game over. Karen tried to fight back, tried to argue that the bylaws allowed for an emergency appointment, but the truth was undeniable. She had been running the HOA without any legal authority for years. With every new revelation, Karen's last remaining allies on the board began jumping ship. One by one, they resigned, cutting ties with her to save themselves. The HOA's lawyer quit on the spot, refusing to represent her in the inevitable lawsuit that was now looming over her head. But the most powerful moment came later that evening, when something unexpected happened. For the first time since the scandal broke, neighbors started talking to each other. Not whispering in fear, not avoiding eye contact on the sidewalk, but having real conversations. They shared their own stories, their frustrations, their anger at how they had let Karen control their lives. And as if to put a final exclamation point on the day's events, a group of residents walked onto their lawns and tore down their HOA violation notices, one by one. Some even replaced them with signs that read "Report HOA Abuse," turning what had once been a neighborhood under Karen's thumb into a community standing together. The news cameras caught everything, and by nightfall, our story had spread beyond just local headlines. It had gone national. But even with Karen's downfall well underway, the real battle was just beginning. Sarah wasn't going to stop at just fixing our neighborhood. She was about to change HOA laws forever. The next morning, I woke up to an overwhelming flood of messages from neighbors, friends, and even strangers across the country, all sharing their own HOA horror stories. It wasn't just our neighborhood. This kind of abuse was happening everywhere. My inbox was filled with personal accounts of families being harassed over minor home modifications, elderly residents being fined into financial ruin, and disabled homeowners being denied the right to accessibility. The sheer scale of it was staggering. But while the messages kept pouring in, the real game changer was what Sarah had been quietly working on behind the scenes. She had spent the entire night finalizing a new state bill aimed at protecting homeowners from HOA overreach. It wasn't just a reaction to Karen's actions. It was a permanent fix that would prevent people like her from ever abusing their power again. And when she introduced the Right to Home Happiness Act, it wasn't just our community that cheered. It was the entire state. But before the law could even be voted on, Karen's downfall had one last chapter to unfold. That afternoon, she attempted one final, desperate move. She showed up at our house, flanked by the two remaining HOA board members who hadn't resigned yet, waving a new set of violation notices as if she still had any authority left. But this time, instead of finding fear, she walked straight into a meeting between Sarah and a team of legal experts who were actively drafting new protections against HOA abuse. The moment Karen saw who was in the room, the color drained from her face. She tried to argue, tried to insist that the board still had some control over our neighborhood, but the reality was the HOA as she had run it was finished. With the majority of the board gone, the remaining members voted to dissolve the current leadership immediately, stripping Karen of any last shred of power she had been clinging to. But the real final blow came when the leaked security footage hit the news. Video evidence of Karen personally forging documents, faking violation notices, and even bragging about finding homeowners she didn't like spread across social media like wildfire. And within hours, she wasn't just facing a lawsuit, she was under criminal investigation. 2 days later, we watched Karen pack up her beloved rose bushes, the one she had forced everyone else to copy and drive away. For good. But the story didn't end there. Our neighborhood underwent a transformation. The new HOA board was formed by actual community members, not power-hungry tyrants, and they rewrote the entire rulebook to ensure fairness for everyone. The old violations office? It was turned into a community resource center to help neighbors instead of punishing them. And Sarah's wheelchair ramp? It was rebuilt, bigger, better, and with a beautiful design created by local artists. Instead of being an eyesore, it became a symbol of change. But the best part? The movement didn't stop at our street. Sarah's new law passed, ensuring that no HOA in the state could ever abuse homeowners the way Karen had. And just like that, what started as a battle over one wheelchair ramp became something much bigger, a revolution that changed the system for good.